Again, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session on how to put your thesis document together. And I'm speaking specifically about your PhD thesis, although much of this could actually hold for your master's thesis too, but I don't think we have any master's students in our audience today. I'm going to switch my camera off so that I am not distracted by this moving head in the corner. I want to make it very clear that I'm giving a general talk about a thesis document. It's what I go through with my students, but every other supervisor might have their way of doing things as well. So you have to go with what your supervisor says. I'm just going to give guidelines, the same ones I give my students, and I'll give a rationale for them. And in general, they are accepted, but you might have a supervisor who will want you to mention your limitations in your introduction, for example, whereas I'm going to suggest that they come in the final chapter. It doesn't matter. Just remember that what I'm telling you now is just a guideline. And I'm going to go through the national and the local guidelines as well, just to show you that there are prescriptions into what should go into this document, but also there's a lot of latitude for you to make this your research project. So first of all, what is a thesis or a dissertation? And those terms are often used interchangeably. They're both the same thing in the English language, but in America, apparently, the doctoral publication is called the dissertation, and a master's level one is called a thesis. And in the UK and most of those universities that go with the UK system, like South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, etc., we have it the other way around. A master's is a dissertation and a PhD is a thesis. So it doesn't really matter. But what a thesis is a scholarly document that is presented in such a way that it exhibits the scientific process. And I think that makes a lot of sense. You are showing research questions, you're showing methods, results, you're discussing, you're contributing to the field of science, etc. So that is what the thesis is intended to be. It's not just a collection of papers. It's got to show that there is some thinking behind it, that is presented in such a way that the scientific process has been well exhibited. So let's have a look at our national guidelines. So it's all very well saying you're going to register for a PhD and you're going to do some research and you're going to write it up. But what is it that our country requires of you to show that you have been doctorate? And for those of you who attended the early lectures on doctorateness, you'll remember the CHE guidelines, where you have knowledge and skills. So let's examine those in some detail. In terms of knowledge, what is expected of you in this country is that you must be well informed and have relevant knowledge in a discipline. And through an original contribution and through independent study, you will integrate whatever you're going to find into existing knowledge, thereby advancing the frontiers of knowledge. In addition to being well informed and well versed, you must be able to make a contribution to debates around that topic. So you can see that a doctoral student is expected to show a pretty high level of thinking. And can you do that in a thesis? Of course you can. Your thesis is going to have many opportunities for you to show that you have a broad and well-informed knowledge of your discipline. It moves on as a different point, but I think it's part of the same one, is that you must demonstrate expert, specialized, and in-depth current knowledge. And how do you do that? Well, by showing you've got current knowledge, you're going to show how good your literature review is. And also what literature you're going to be using in discussing your results. So yes, can we show that expert specialized knowledge? Yes, we can show that in a thesis. Then showing insight into the interconnectedness of your topic. I think in medicine, it's pretty easy to do that. We often work with laboratories, that we're interconnected with other service providers, etc. And through our publications, we're going to be able to show that you are working with other fields as well as your own. There must be an ethical awareness. And now this goes beyond just your ethics application. There must be some sort of scientific integrity and ethical persuasion that comes through your entire thesis. And that can be done through your publications, in your introduction, in your concluding chapters. And then always for a PhD, nationally and internationally, as they're looking for an original contribution to the field of study. So those are the 4 knowledge areas, all very easy to show that you are advanced in that area in your thesis. Then the Council for Higher Education have got these skills. So they're expecting to find that a doctoral student will be able to evaluate a selection of research approaches. And I've put in the corner here the totality of evidence-based medicine wheel, just to show, sorry, let me close this. Can I ask everybody to switch their videos off because some people have streaming issues? So this evidence-based medicine wheel, the totality of evidence-based medicine wheel, shows you the different kinds of research that can be covered. So in many of my students' work, we do reviews that form 4 parts into that blue section at the top, where we do a scoping review, which is a kind of higher order analysis of literature that's already available. There are various kinds of clinical studies. We often work with case series and cohort studies, etc. Sometimes my students are involved with laboratory work where we've got mechanisms. So you can be working across many different types of research methods in your clinical research. And you'll see later, when you're expected to communicate research findings to more than just a scholarly audience, you can start doing editorials and writing expert opinions, especially towards the end of your PhD process. So they also want to see reflection and autonomy. So it's hard to show autonomy in a thesis, but reflection, that's what your concluding chapter is. Your synthesis chapter, there should be a lot of reflection in that chapter there. Then when it comes to communication skills, relevant digital literacy skills, clearly in your literature review chapter, you're going to talk about how you accessed your data, how you logged your papers, how you categorized your papers, whether you used a referencing system that's expected of you, how you use that in your papers, how you used, possibly you went further in your scoping review and used something like in vivo to do thematic analysis of your papers. All of these things should be pretty explicitly set out for your examiner to see that you have got these communication skills. Then lastly, critical and analytical thinking for problem solving. Well, what is your thesis? Your thesis is a document showing that you identified a problem and you went about trying to find out how to solve that problem, and then you did solve the problem. So if we reflect on what the Council for Higher Education wants, this also gives you some idea of how you should present your work in your thesis. It's not just a collection of papers and just a few chapters. You have to, it's an expose of how you have acquired all this knowledge and all these skills. And I'll come back to it in the end. I would like my students going forward to actually address all of these in the appendices to say how they have gained their knowledge and skills throughout the PhD process, and put that document, reflect on their growth and put that document in the appendices for the examiner to see. So not only have we got these Council of Higher Education attributes that we can see in a thesis, these only came out 4 years ago. We've got the Council of the NQF, the National Qualifications Framework, which has got a very detailed layout of what is required at different academic levels, right from primary school through to the doctorate. So for all those levels, there are detailed requirements for the scope of your knowledge literacy. How do you engage with method and procedure? How are you around problem solving? Ethics comes up again. Accessing and managing information, producing and communicating information, looking at context and systems, managing your learning, and accountability. So you can see that the CHE attributes have picked up a lot of what's coming out of the NQF guidelines. And if you look at both of these documents, they have a lot in common with the similar documents from Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom. So it's an international standard. It's not South Africa making up their own standards so that we can just produce lots of doctorates. This is to ensure that there is doctoral mobility for all our doctoral candidates. So if you get a doctorate in South Africa and you have been able to acquire all these skills and knowledge attributes, then you're going to be pretty competent as a doctoral candidate or as somebody with a doctorate in any other country in the world. So it's always good to write, especially at the end of your doctoral program, to reflect to see how did you gain this knowledge? How did you gain these skills? Have you become doctorate in your view? Right, now let's come down from having had a look at our national guidelines, which are very much linked to international guidelines, to see what the university has got. So our college has got a document, just copied and pasted the heading onto this, the guidelines for the presentations of master's and PhD dissertations or thesis. And I've asked Prof. Heft to put this document onto the Doctoral Academy website. But I want you to realize that these are guidelines. And when I saw the word count, the hair on the back of my neck bristled, because the last thing you want to be doing when you're finishing your PhD is worry about word counts. You've got to worry about making sure you present a really good thesis. And if you can do it in 8,000 words, great. If it takes you 30,000 words to do it, great. As long as the quality of the work is good. So those guidelines are there only as guidelines and they are not prescriptive. But I want to show you the next interesting thing. So we've got this guideline, but this is the document that goes out to the examiner. So I've only blocked out that blue pieces, that I've blocked out what was stated about the masters. But your examiner is only given these 9 lines on which to examine your thesis. So, and the first few lines, the first 3 lines are just gobbledygook. Then all they've got to look for is understand the nature and purpose of your, to see that you understand the nature and purpose of your investigation, that you're acquainted with the literature, that you command the necessary techniques, you're capable of assessing significance of your findings, that you have independent and critical thought, you're thorough, consistent, there's a logical development, and there's a strong conclusion, and that your literary style is pretty cool. And then lastly, that is important world over is that you've got to make an original contribution to the field. So currently, these guidelines are pretty thin in terms of what I have just shown you our national requirements are for doctorateness. But it's up to you to make sure that you present your thesis in such a way that your examiner is going to have his socks knocked off looking at these particular attributes hidden in that, just those 6 lines that are there. Right, let's have a look at the 2 types of thesis that we've got. So up until a couple of decades ago, maybe even just 1 decade, the traditional monograph thesis is what most people produced. So that the front matter is always the same. It's got all that stuff to do with your declaration, your acknowledgements, your dedication, all sorts of things like that. And it ends with your table of contents. That is the same. It never changes. And then there was an introduction, literature review chapter. And if you have a look at the guidelines suggest merging the introduction and literature review chapter, but I'm going to say that that's not a very good idea, because the introduction serves a purpose. It serves to introduce the entirety of your research. Your literature review gives your examiner the opportunity to actually see how you engage with the literature. And I'll get to talk about that a little later on in the presentation. So after the literature review, which serves to show where the literature was when the project started, so that there were gaps that could be filled in. Or sometimes people do the literature review afterwards, but I don't see any point in that. But I'll get back to literature review later. But after your introduction, you've got your literature review. Your literature review shows the state of the research in the world, how it's led you to do your research, and then you have either a methods chapter, or you can have several methods chapters in a PhD, because you might have different methods that you're going to follow. You might have a quantitative study, and you're going to triangulate that with a qualitative study. So you might have one methods chapter that looks at both of them, or if the work is so extensive, you might want to split that up into the different chapters. And then your results chapters would mirror that. So if you split your methods chapter, you'll split your results chapter in the same way. And the results chapters are just reporting what you saw. And then you have your discussion, which is pulling all your work together. And then conclusions, recommendations, limitations, and recommendations for future research. So that is what a monograph would look like. And I have never supervised a monograph. I think a lot of people still do them. I am not confident that I'm competent in this. I also feel that it is a wasted opportunity, because a lot of people who produce a monograph never produce a paper. And so they end up with a CV with a thesis and no publications. So I'm an advocate of the thesis by publication. Thesis by publication is not easier at all than the monograph, and the monograph is not easier than the thesis by publication. They are just different. But what happens with a thesis by publication is a couple of things. One is that there are defined inside projects that a very busy clinician in particular can manage. So each paper can be seen as a project that needs to be finished. And as they are finishing this, they're getting it published, they're building up their thesis. There's a breaking down of the entire thesis into these bite-sized pieces, and the thesis is being developed throughout the time of the study. So there's no need to take a 6-month sabbatical at the end to do the write-up of the monograph, which very often happens. The write-up is left to the end, and it can actually be very onerous at that level. So the one advantage is it breaks the work up into bite-sized pizzas. Secondly, you are adding to your CV by getting these publications. So not only will you have a PhD on your CV by the time you graduate, you will also have a number of publications. But the biggest advantage to society and to the people who are part of your study is that the results become publicly available. Yes, a thesis becomes publicly available, but not the same way that publications become available. So we owe it to our participants in our research to publish. It's much harder to publish through the monograph route, and this way we are assured that we're seeing to our ethical responsibility of making sure that the research becomes publicly available. So what the thesis by publication will look like, it's not that different to the thesis by monograph at the beginning and the end. The front matter is exactly the same. The introduction would be the same. And then I prefer a literature review separate. And for a doctorate, I actually like to see a literature review that has a method. And I always ask my students to produce a scoping review. And there's an advantage to doing the scoping review. One is it's done right in the beginning of the research. So the student has had to truly immerse in the literature and they really do get a much better view of what has happened in that field of research. Secondly, you can actually show where the gaps are and you can really therefore justify your work. And another very nice advantage is very often these are published. And in fact, I've got one student whose scoping review was published earlier this year, and it's been the talk of the discipline. It's the international speaker who came out for a conference highlighted his scoping review. So it's another form of communication, scientific communication, that has highlighted, in his case, highlighted the fact that there's so little research in his area. So lots of advantages to doing a scoping review. And I've had 2 students actually go as far as doing a more in-depth systematic review, and both of them were also published. Then after you've done the literature review, which aims to show where the gaps in your literature, in your research area are, you then put your papers in. And those papers can be organized in different ways. But what has to happen is they've got to be organized in a logical way. So I always like a third chapter or a second paper to be a situational analysis. For example, what is the situation with esophageal cancer in South Africa? So let's have a look. How many people actually, how many centers in the country are there? Are there any statistics kept, etc.? And you can get a publication out of that because that forms a really nice baseline to your study. And then all the papers will follow on to that. So you can be doing genetics work, you can be doing other therapeutic work, you can be looking at sending patients for an alternative treatment. For example, you might send an esophageal cancer person to, I'm making this up as I go, for counseling. And is that done? See, what benefits are there for sending a patient for counseling before they go for cancer treatment, etc. But these chapters, there's no limit to them. And very often I've had students who've actually produced 6, 7, 8 papers, because as the research develops, so they are able to see new little research questions and we can get papers out. And I'm not talking salami slicing here. I'm seeing that somebody sees an opportunity that it wasn't a question they thought of before. It's covered by their ethics. The data is covered by their ethics. And now we can get another paper. I'm thinking now with my one student, we did not plan to look at the legal issues around disabilities, with genetic disorders. And halfway through her thesis, we thought, nobody's written this down. We don't have one place where we can go and look at the law on disabilities and genetics. And so we produced another paper. The point I'm trying to make is this can grow. You can end up with some papers and it becomes hard to create the golden thread. And the golden thread is that thread from your literature reviews to your discussion that tells a story. We can't just throw these papers in without your examiner seeing the scientific process, how the research developed. And very often you can then actually categorize your different papers into various parts. So sometimes after the literature review, we might have part 1, part 2, and part 3. Part 1 might be looking at the epidemiology of cleft lip and palate across the country. So we might have 2 papers on that. We might have what was happening in our particular province, and then we might have another paper that looked at collaborations between the Smile Train and other African countries. So that could be part 1, is what is cleft lip and palate on our continent. Then the second part could be how do those patients get managed? What kinds of surgery do they get, and what kinds of follow-up exist? So there could be a whole part on that. And that is how you can start making a lot more sense out of your research, so that your examiner can see that there is a scholarly work that's developing an argument and seeing how it's going to contribute. And then we get to the end, the conclusions, recommendations, etc., very similar to your monograph, but in your monograph, those are generally 2 separate chapters. The conclusions would be the last one, but your discussion would be a second last one. But in the case of a thesis by publication, you've done so much of that in each publication that I believe we can do 1 chapter at the end where it all comes in. And if you can see, I have called chapter 1 and the final chapter bookends, because they kind of bring all your work together. Your introduction shows what you're going to do, why it's important. Your bookend shows what you found and what it's going to contribute. And your examiner is going to look at your thesis almost in the way we are looking at the screen now. And they're going to often start by reading your introduction and reading your conclusions. So we're going to get to looking at each of those chapters and what should be in each of those chapters just now. But I want you to realize, how are you going to present your work so that if your examiner reads your 2 bookend chapters and nothing else, are they able to tick all those CHE or NQF guidelines? So just because everything else in the middle has been published, it doesn't mean that you've exhibited doctorateness. So to me, the most important chapters, other than your literature review, in your thesis are these 2 bookend chapters. They are what show how you have become doctorate and how you deserve to be part of the world academe. So let's go through each section now. Let's look at, firstly, the introduction. So I have just copied and pasted from the college guidelines because they are generally quite okay. If you look anywhere on the internet, if you look at other resources, this is what an introduction would look like for any thesis. You would first of all start off by giving some sort of background to your study. And the red bits here is what I've added. This is your opening. This is the first thing your examiner is going to read. He's going to want to see an overview of what the research is about, see the context that you're working in, see what kind of key theories you're going to be using. If you are using theories, we don't always do that. See the concepts that you're going to be working with and work on your terminology, and keep, if there's another tip, I haven't written it anywhere else, keep your terminology consistent throughout your thesis, from your pre-matter, the front matter where you've got your overview of the thesis. Keep your terminology constant. So after that, that should take a good few paragraphs. You go and describe the core research problem and its significance and how the value of your research is going to contribute here. Then the guidelines here, the college guidelines say we want a deep, coherent overview of the literature. I'm saying I don't think so. That you would use some literature here because it's part of your background, it's part of your context and the description. But I don't think that you should do a literature review in your introduction. It should be a totally separate document that could be analyzed on its own. Then we want to see a coherent problem statement, clear and smart research questions. And I had to look up what SMART stood for. It's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound type of questions. They want to see your aims and objectives, and or a theoretical framework. Remember, we don't always use a theoretical framework. A conceptual framework is also not something that we often use in clinical studies, but if you're going to be doing a research project that has a lot of qualitative work in it, you might have to look at getting down to a conceptual framework. Then you're going to describe the area of study and your general methodology, and you might have used several different methodologies. And in fact, it's its own chapter in your monograph. And then you're going to talk about what the thesis is going to look like. You're going to say, in the rest of the thesis, we're going to have an in-depth look at the literature. We're going to look at the state of the art of the discipline in our country. In paper 1, in paper 2, we're looking at so-and-so, etc. So that is what your introductory chapter would be. And it must be dense. This is, after all, the highest scholarly communication we can get. It's got to be dense in terms of information, but it must also be written in such a way that it's easy to read. So paragraphing, numbering, short sentences, but detailed. Okay. So let's go on to the literature review section now. And obviously the introduction area, what I spoke about there, is appropriate for both your monograph and the thesis by publication. So the literature review is my favorite part of all research. And here I keep saying this, that a literature review is both a verb and a noun. And it should start almost before you come to the university and say, I want to do a PhD. You have to have started reading. Part of being a doctoral student is being a reader. You should be able, if somebody says, what do? You should say, I'm reading for a PhD. You have to read, read, read. And the literature review section can take different forms. So as I mentioned earlier in the monograph, it can be something that is done right at the end, or it was done for the protocol and then developed and updated towards the end for the thesis. But to me, in a thesis by publication, your literature review should be in the form of a scoping review. So the scoping review is going to help you find exactly the literature that you should be looking at. It's going to help you not go down rabbit holes, and it's going to hone your questioning down. So you're going to end up with maybe 100 papers, fewer sometimes. I've had some people having to come down to about 17 papers. But it's certainly, if you go onto Google Scholar and you look for stuff, you're going to be overwhelmed. You're going to get thousands, and that's not the way to do it. You do not want to be overwhelmed. You want to have only, to start off with only those papers that are really relevant. And then you want all of them. You want all of those papers that are really relevant, not only those that you like. You don't ever want to be seen, excuse me. You don't ever want to be seen as having selected whatever literature you want to write about, so that it influences your literature review to show where your research should be going. If you use a good methodology, it really does show that you're impartial and that your literature review really is an honest view of the state of play, and you're going to fall into that honest state of play to contribute further. Once you have done your once you've written your first literature review, you have to keep up to date with your literature right from the word go. And that way you create alerts. I find Google Scholar alerts fantastic. You get everything that comes up that's new. And you can set those alerts to be weekly or daily. I find daily is a bit overwhelming, but you can get alerts for articles all the time. And keep reading. When you see those alerts, read those abstracts. It all comes on your phone. You can be reading it while you're cooking, while you're walking around your garden, when you're going on a run. If you've got one of those cell phones that can speak text, you can listen to it. But keep up to date with your literature. And in order for you not to forget, keep journaling, keep writing it down. If you've read a couple of abstracts in a week, jot down what those articles were, the titles, the author, the first author. If you're not going to download it and put it into your reference manager, keep your reference manager up to date, because by the time you get to writing your papers, you need the latest data. And you're going to be publishing papers over a good few years, 2 years maybe. You've got to keep up with that literature. And then by the time you write your concluding chapter, you need to put that literature in there. You can say at the beginning there was this gap in the science, but not only I have filled this gap, there are other people who also saw that gap, and there has been a lot of literature in this area since then. So keep journaling, keep up with your literature, keep it in your reference manager. If you have created an in vivo project, keep that up to date. Then, as I said, if you follow the method like a systematic or scoping review, you cannot ever, your examiner will never be able to say, oh, well, why didn't you look at literature by so-and-so? Because if you've done your systematic or scoping review properly, you would have picked up what so-and-so wrote about. And then there are various formats. If you're not going to follow the systematic or scoping review format, which is very much prescribed, you can do it thematically, chronologically, or telescoping. And thematically would mean you look at the themes in the research and synthesize them and talk about the themes. Or you can look at how a discipline has developed. For example, I'm currently looking at evidence-based medicine. So I am going to be looking at everything from Sackett et al. And see how the science of evidence-based medicine has grown over the years. So I'm going to do a much more chronological literature review. And then there's the telescoping way of doing it, where you look at the big international situation, come down to continental, country-specific, and maybe even down to your own province. And then look at what's happening in your province and see how that can be generalized. And that's a traditional way of doing a lot of scientific communication. But the one thing that's important is to make sure that you synthesize and do not present lists. And you won't synthesize if you are journaling, if you are reading and absorbing the information. And I always like to use the term falling in love with your literature. Once you fall in love with your literature, you are not going to be producing lists. You're going to be synthesizing naturally. You're going to be in the shower and you're going to be thinking about these things, and you're going to be synthesizing when you're driving to work. your mind is going to be playing with these ideas, and that is how you come up with new thought. Right, so I'm now going to leave the monograph behind. I'm not going to talk about the specific chapters of the monograph. I'm only going to be talking about the chapters that you find in a PhD, in a thesis by publication. So the central body of your thesis is going to be your published works. Now remember, they don't all have to be published. In fact, I had one student who passed his PhD without a single one being published because he wanted to first be examined and then apply for a patent. So what these all have to be is in the format of an article. So we can have some that are published, some that are in review, and others that have been prepared and that have not yet been sent off. So you don't have to wait for all of your publications to be published. I know that is a misconception out there, but you don't have to. I like my students to have at least a few published. It gives them a lot more confidence when they're writing up, but it's not an absolute necessity before you send it off for examination. So let's have a look at how you arrange these works. What you mustn't think is that an examiner is going to look at these works and think, they've been published, so I'm not going to bother about looking at them. They've already been peer reviewed at the journals. Because you're going to get an examiner who's going to see, but all of these studies are merely descriptive studies. There's nothing here that's showing a deeper analysis. So yeah, there's 6 papers, but it looks like a series of master's papers. So you've got to present this work in such a way that the story comes through, that depth of work is seen, and that there is an intellectual development that comes through. So we don't want to see only descriptive studies. We want to see a variety of different kinds of studies and to see how things have grown. What's also important is that you've got to connect these, and I'm going to talk in more detail on that. So to make certain across all your papers, make sure that your story is there, that the golden thread is there, and order your papers in order to tell that story. For example, you might have your situational analysis, then you might have talking about caregiver experiences, and then you might end up with creating a guideline with your society maybe. If you're going to use parts, you can have a couple of papers. I spoke about parts earlier, maybe on epigenetics, and then one on plain genetics. For example, you might split it. And then you must link the parts. So let me go see if I can go back. In between each of these papers, you can put in a page or two on how you're linking the one chapter to the next. So this linking page that would occur over here would say, having looked at the literature review, we can see that there is a gap in the literature and so on. We do not understand what is actually happening in our country. So in this paper, we have done an in-depth situational analysis of the trauma surgery that has occurred over the last 10 years in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. It's that kind of, it's formal language, but it's telling a story. And you would do that between each of those papers. So once you've done your in-depth analysis, you would say, having established this situation, we are now going to look at what are the staffing issues at various regional hospitals, and that is going to drive your next paper. Also, what I like to see on those pages is the publication details. So I always get my students to put in which journal the papers were published in, or if they have been sent off for review. And then also at each of these papers, I like to put the author's inputs, because there are a lot of different authors on different papers. So it makes sense that on that page, you would say if there were 5 authors and you were the first author, You would say that you conceptualized the study, etc. Author 2 did the next things, the author 3 did the statistics, etc. So I like to see all that information on one page so that the examiner can really get an idea of what your input has been in the thesis. Because remember, they could look at a thesis and think, there have been across 5 papers, there are 20 different authors. How much did the student actually do on their own? So I like the students to always make sure that they put explicitly on that page their role that shows their doctorateness. You can also include papers where you are not the first author, but then just be honest about it and state there that this paper, you were part of the team, it fits in with your research, and you are the second author because the first author did something else. And that's all good because it shows your examiner that you're part of an academic team as well. So when it comes to these chapters, for my students, I like to see at least some of them published, but if it's not possible, I'm not going to hold a student back from examination. I like to see that they are the first author on the majority of the papers and first author on at least 3. So those are the kinds of guidelines I have for my students, and I have never had a student fail with those criteria. They are hard, but then you don't do a PhD because it's easy, but it's doable. I've graduated 19 students, all very happily, and they've all got very good CVs. So let's move on to the last bookend chapter. And if the introduction is important, the last chapter is 3 times more important, because in the introduction, you are really just showing intellectual capacity as far as being able to identify a good research question and state how you are going to try and solve the research questions that you have created in order to address the research problem. By the time you come to your final chapter, you have really got to put a lot more reflection into your work. You have got to see the consequences of your work. There's a lot more that you've got to show. There's a lot more that's got to come out of your own thinking to show doctorateness here. So this is such an important chapter, and I'll give you some tips on how to do that. And as I said earlier, you can split it into a discussion chapter and a conclusions chapter, but I do feel that given that you have got discussion and conclusions already in all your papers, and if you've got 5 papers, it's 5 to 10 pages at most already in your thesis, that one chapter combining this is adequate for this type of thesis. So the purpose of this final chapter is for you to interpret and explain the results of your project. You're going to unpack your findings of each paper in terms of meaning, as well as the significance and the implications for practice. And it should summarize your key findings. So here's just some tips. In the next slide, I will give you a kind of a structure. You're going to restate your research questions, your aims, objectives, and here you're going to answer them. You're going to summarize your key findings, unpack in detail, link back to the literature, your updated literature. So you've been updating your literature in each of the publications as they've been published. And now you're using the latest literature to talk about your entire research project. And you look at how your work aligns with everything else that you are seeing in the literature. You're going to state what your contributions are, how they're going to fit into this body of literature now. And of course, you're going to mention your limitations, but you're not, and I'll go into details on limitations later, you're not going to diss your work. You're not going to spend 2 pages on limitations, and I'll get to details about that on the next slide. You'll also make recommendations on further research and on possible practice changes. Let's hope that in most of our clinical work that we will have some sort of change as a result of our research. And then you're going to provide your concluding summary. And remember, that might be the first thing that your examiner reads, that concluding summary. Further tips, just make sure that there are very strong links between your introduction chapter and your final chapter. Remember, I told you that maybe your examiner is going to read only those chapters to start with. So he wants to get a very good picture of what this research is about. So if your introduction looks very different to your conclusion, it's going to be very confusing, and it's going to put your examiner on the back foot, and he's going to say, this is going to be a hard job. And he might be one of those examiners that takes months and months and months to respond. In this section, you need to be confident, you need to be firm, but you also need to be humble. You will never use language like, my research has proven. You'd rather say, the results of the study indicate that. So you keep a humility. Remember, you are entering research. There are lots of people who have done a lot more research than you have. So keep your humility. There's no way a single thesis in general proves anything. It's usually a body of work that together comes together, can come together as a single body that proves things. One very important thing is never introduce anything new in this last chapter. Sometimes while you're writing this last chapter, you might realize that something has come to mind. If you're going to include that new thing, you must go all the way back to your introduction and make sure that the whole golden thread of your entire thesis actually does marry up. And don't worry about repetition. I think Cecile Badenhorst mentioned that earlier. It's more engaging with your reader. It's to make sure that your reader is reminded constantly. And your examiners will read globally. They're going to read sections at a time. They're not going to read from page 1 to page 200. They're going to read different chapters. After they've read your beginning and end, they might just choose what interests them the most to read next in the middle of your thesis, and then go back and forth. And then always in the section, make sure that you use the updated literature. So your structure would have 6 parts to it. You'd have an introduction where you're going to tell the reader what to expect in this chapter. You're going to explain how your thesis has achieved its research aims. You're going to discuss how your study has contributed to the field, what you've achieved, how your work has added value, how it can be applied in the real world setting. Mention also any research outputs. Tell them how many publications you've got. Tell them how many conference presentations you did, how many posters, how many talks, etc., and so on. But while you're writing here, write reflectively. And when you write reflectively, you can't sit down and write for 2 or 3 hours. Writing reflectively is something that takes a good couple of days, if not weeks. As you write, you must think and think, if I did it this way, what are the consequences? Had I done it another way, what has really come out of this? Did I meet my expectations? So just keep being reflective. Acknowledge your limitations of the study. But as I said, there's times when I've had to cut the students' limitations down, because after you've read their limitations, you think, well, what's the value of this research anyway? It's so bad. It's not like that. There are limitations to every single study that is published in any journal, no matter what the Q rating or H value. Every single study has got limitations, and these limitations occur around sampling issues, limited access to resources, etc. But don't put into the limitations things that just make it look pathetic. I mean, one of the limitations that came out in one of the theses that passed this year was COVID actually happened and I could not get to the lab. So I could not actually deal with my samples. I had to deal with I got the reports. So that was a limitation, and that's real world. That's what happens. And then you must recommend further work to push your science forward and change practice. And acknowledging limitations and recommending further work actually shows that you have developed a capacity of thinking around research where you are able to make judgment calls, where you can judge quality of research, where you can judge how your research can actually improve things and how it can change things. And then lastly, your key take-home message, that final paragraph in this thesis, I have been able to indicate that, and the most important things come out after that. Right, let's look at appendices. Appendices, again, the same in both types of thesis. Here, remember the CHE and the NQF guidelines look for ethics, so put your ethics approvals in there. It's unlikely that your examiner will look for them, but if he just sees that they're there, he'll be able to tick off, yeah, you've dealt with ethics. Put your recertifications in, gatekeeper permissions, etc. If you have done any conference presentations, put in a reduced size poster, put in your presentations, so the examiner can flip through at the back and see, you have communicated science at another level other than a thesis or as a publication. And if you've had any articles, if you've written for the press, or if somebody's written about you and your research, put those in as well. So for example, if Marianne has come and written about your research in genetics before you've put your thesis together, put that article in. It's always good as the examiner flips through to see, there's some little extra bits here. It's going to change the way I think about your work. Good. That is a very quick run through what a thesis should look like. And I can now give you some time for questions. Bearing in mind that Kumzili has to also go home at some point. I didn't realize I was going to take up the whole hour. I thought I was going to talk for about half an hour. Thank you for Ziwe. Thank you for that. I'm glad, and this talk will be available on YouTube for you to go back for any details. Are there any other questions? I hope you're not all overwhelmed. I hope what you've seen now is, I can do this. I can do it by points. I can take a point out of that presentation and spend a day or so on it, and it can be doable. Okay, it doesn't seem to be that there are any questions. Okay, then that just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Prof.